And continuing our reading in the book of Esther from the 4th chapter, now at the 9th verse. Hear now God's word. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance may arise for Jews from another quarter. But for you and your father's family, you will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast also, as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is the word of the Lord. Thomas Wolfe's autobiographical novel, Look's Homeward Angel, is about one man's struggle, a young man's struggle, to find the purpose, the direction of his life. Growing up in an incredibly dysfunctional family with an abusive, alcoholic father, growing up in the fictitious town of Altamont, North Carolina, Asheville, Eugene falls in love with literature and then falls in love with a little bit older woman in his mother's boarding house who breaks his heart. Well, he goes off to college in Chapel Hill, where he is sort of considered to be an uneducated, rude hillbilly in the sophisticated town of Chapel Hill. But there he begins to receive some recognition as a writer and a journalist. After college, Eugene's mother wants him to come home and to work for the newspaper, but Eugene knows that that path is not for him. He knows that he has to leave home to find his way, his purpose in life. And so Thomas Wolfe writes of Eugene. He knew he would always be the sad one, caged in that little round of skull, imprisoned in that beating and most secret heart. His life must always walk down lonely passages, lost. We spend a lot of time in our lives wondering who we are, what we're called to do and to be, where we are to go, what our life's purpose is. What does God want of us? High school seniors are asked about their plans after graduation. Okay, is it going to be a gap year, military, college, work? What are you thinking about? And when all you can do to get out of bed on time is to moan and to groan and try not to be late for classes, you don't want to hear your family members ask, "Well, what would you like to major in? What kind of work do you want to do?" Work? Come on. We ask anxious college seniors, particularly those who have no plans for the future, for work or for graduate school, to tell us about your plans. Oh boy, they love that. Well, thank God, help may come through vocational testing, through internships, through coaches and career counselors. And I think for over 100 years, our scouting program here at the church has provided guidance to young men, just as Girl Scouts do for young women. But sometimes even all of these things are not enough. And later in life, we may face our own questions about life's meaning and purpose. Some may be so invested in the career, they neither look to the right nor to the left. They don't think about much of these things. They just pour it out for 20, for 30 years, and suddenly one morning they wake up and they say, "Was this it? Was my work all? Is it enough? Our children grow up, they move away, we retire from a life of work. We may move to Florida to get away from this Indiana cold. We ask ourselves, what next? What's my purpose now? In the book of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon looks at the work of his hands. He has gained great wealth and wisdom and power and pleasure, and he wonders, well, what have I gained from all of this? He writes in Ecclesiastes, "Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it, and all was vanity, chasing after the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun." Ooh, a hard but very real conclusion for many of us when we have simply skated across the surface of life. Esther. Queen Esther was a young Jewish girl who had to face some pretty tough questions about the purpose and the meaning of her life. As I shared with the children, when the book of Esther is read within the Jewish community on the festival of Purim, that is the casting of the lots, Purim is a bit like Halloween or Mardi Gras. The kids dress up with costumes, they put on crowns, they have a great time. And when the scroll of Esther is read, the congregation hiss and boo and stomp their feet at the evil name of Haman, even as they cheer Esther. There will be no hissing and booing at the conclusion of the sermon today. Haman. Ooh. Haman sought to destroy all the exiled Jews of Persia. For behind the delights of this oriental tale is a serious drama. It is a story about life and death. It is a story about the victory of good over evil. It is a story about a young woman who risked her life to save her people. Now, on the surface, we might think that, hey, Esther had it pretty easy, didn't she? Yeah. I mean, she was chosen out of all the beautiful young girls of the kingdom to be a part of the king's harem. Her life was set. But when we look a little more deeply into the story, we realize that Esther did not have the luxury that most of us have of making decisions about our own future. For the most part, those decisions were made for her. Her parents were dead. Imagine that at that time. She was an orphan, but she had been taken in by her cousin Mordecai as a ward. Esther was a member of a minority religious group living in exile in Persia, and like so many displaced persons today, her status and the status of her people could change in an instant. Do you know there are 66 million people who are displaced in our world today? The largest number in the history of humankind. 23 million of those, I believe, are displaced outside their own countries. Esther had no say in the matter of being chosen first for the harem and then later to be queen. Esther had no say in the matter when they fed her delicacies, when they perfumed her, when they gave her beauty treatments for the whole of the year so that she might be pleasing in the sight of a king she did not even know. Things can look pretty different on the inside. Things can look like a palace from the outside, but a prison on the inside. And she became queen, a Jewish queen, although she hid her identity. She became queen. How? Because Queen Vashti disobeyed the king and refused his command. And what happened to Queen Vashti? Gone. Executed. But her destiny did not consist in simply being a queen. Oh no. Being a queen was far more like her fate, over which she had very little control. But God had a destiny in mind for her. Our destiny, Our God-given purpose in life cannot be defined simply by what we do with the work of our hands and the toil and the labor and the sweat of the brow, by what we do at home as a parent, a child, a spouse, or what we do at school or at the office or in business or at university or our profession. Oh no. Our purpose, our destiny may appear suddenly while we're involved in other things. Our destiny may surprise us as we're going along with our accustomed routines, or our destiny, like that of Esther, may come to us as a divine disruption in a moment of crisis. Think about your life and my life. In our lives, there are so many things that are simply beyond our control. We come into the world with a certain genetic makeup. I didn't choose mine. Did you choose yours? Well, I don't know. Maybe you did. We grow up in particular families. We grow up in certain communities. We have various opportunities, education, relationships. Like Esther, we may find ourselves in situations over which we have very little say or power. So you might say, like Esther, there is a fated character to our lives as well. In his remarkable book, Against Fate, the Notre Dame professor, Glenn Tender, says that when you and I can recognize the fated character of human existence, that is, when we recognize that we are bound by many factors in this life over which we have little say, then you and I may discover the freedom to create a destiny. In other words, in the midst of the pressures upon us, the circumstances of our lives, the work that we do, we may listen to the voice of God and discover what it is that God has for us to do and to be. And like Esther, our divine purpose may arise in how we respond to a crisis. Our divine purpose may come as it did for the Jews in exile, when Mordecai laid before Esther the plight of her people. When we become awakened to the plight of the people around us. For Mordecai lays before Esther the plans that Haman has hatched with the consent and the decree of the king to destroy all the Jews of the empire. And what does she do? At the risk of her own life, she prays, she fasts, she goes into the king not knowing whether he will receive her or have her put to death. But Mordecai sends her these words as she prepares to make her decision. Do not think that at the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Her fate is to be the queen, but her destiny is to be the deliverer of her people. And in her cousin's words, she hears the voice of God. Most of us in this sanctuary are familiar with the German pastor during the Second World War, Martin Niemöller. After the war, he became famous throughout the world because of his courageous resistance to the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews. Prior to and during the war, he was incarcerated in 2 different concentration camps and came a hairbreadth from losing his life. But what we may not be aware of about Martin Niemöller is that when German National Socialism or Nazism was on the rise, and before Hitler came to full power, he was attracted to some of the ideals of the Nazi movement. You see, he was born in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular culture, and he was born into a German culture at that time in which anti-Semitism was a part of the socio-political landscape. He had what you might say a fated existence. So much of the world around him was beyond his control, and even the world within him. But as he began to listen more and more to the terrible message of Hitler and their horrifying plans, he turned against it. He stood against it. He preached and protested the horror of Hitler's plans. He listened to the voice of God that he had known through the scriptures and through the faithful people of his congregation. And he created a destiny in the midst of his fated existence to stand against Hitler. After the war, he repeated of his anti-Semitic statements. He repented publicly of those early ideas. But it was Martin Niemöller who said on a variety of education these words which will be familiar to your ears. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the communists, but I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for the homosexuals, and I did not speak out because I was not a homosexual. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. Those words are still compelling words for you and for me as we think about that destiny, that purpose, that calling that God has given us. For we are called to such a time and a place as this. No matter who we are, what age we are, what we do, God is always speaking to us, calling to us, cajoling us, and sometimes even hitting us in the head with a 2x4 so that you and I might wake up and hear the voice of God. God comes to us in times of crisis, and God comes to us in the most ordinary circumstances of our lives to stand up, to do what is right, to work for justice and peace, to be life-giving, even when it means swimming against the streams of our culture. Speaking out, taking a risk like Esther, like Martin Niemöller, keeping the faith. In this time and in this place, what is God saying to you in the here and the now? Do you remember the Swedish diplomat Dag Hammarskjöld? He was the second general secretary of the newly formed United Nations after the Second World War. Dag Hammarskjöld was killed in a very suspicious plane crash in Africa. They think it was a murder, while he was on his way to negotiate a peace deal in an African nation. Dag Hammarskjöld was a devout Christian, and he saw his diplomatic work as his calling, his destiny, his vocation in life. And I remember in high school when I picked up that book, that publicized diary of his known as Markings. You remember it? And in that book, I remember being touched by these words. I don't know who or what put the question. I don't even know when it was put. I don't even remember answering, but at some moment I did answer yes to someone or to something. And from that hour I was certain that existence is meaningful, and that therefore my life in self-surrender had a goal. We are called, all of us, each one of us. We are called to respond to the God who speaks to us in the clutter of life, in the quiet moments of prayer, in the acts of service, in the beauty of sacred worship and music, in the voice of the stranger, in the pain of our world, in the labor of our hands, and the thoughts of our minds. We are called to respond. And as you open your heart and your mind to God today, to what God is saying to you at this moment to which God has called you, hear the words from our affirmation of faith from the United Church of Canada. We are not alone. We live in God's world. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and to serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. This is our destiny for such a time as this. Amen.